But now it's high time I come to our speaker, because indeed Ms. Birgit van Hout will talk to us today about the EU's role in protecting democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and civic space. Quite a mouthful. And the United Nations perspective, because that is, of course, where she comes from. Because the question of how the EU, in cooperation with other actors, such as the United Nations, can strengthen civil society, goes to the heart of many of the issues that we are facing and that are also being addressed in the RECONNECT project. And let me say about Ms. Birgit van Hout, she's regional representative for Europe at the UN's Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. She has a very impressive track record. She has extensive experience in human rights protection. She has served in a number of high-level posts at the United Nations Human Rights Office over the past decades. She has worked in areas such as human rights monitoring and violence prevention, anti-discrimination dialogues, human rights training, capacity building, particularly in Africa. She has also served as coordinator of the Outreach and United Nations Reform in the UN's Treaty Division as part of a process to the strengthening of the United Nations human rights reporting and compliance system. She is now with us in her current position since 2017, working tirelessly to advance the protection and promotion of human rights for all within and beyond Europe. That's it. I'm very sure that Ms. van Hout will share with us some very, very interesting insights from a United Nations perspective. And I think that's very important because, let's face it, we are here in Brussels very often in a kind of EU bubble. And we continue to see things, of course, in the big institutional scenery that we have here in Brussels, but we should not forget that Brussels is a heart of multilateralism, not just for the EU, not just for NATO, not just for all the bilateral missions and embassies here in Brussels, not just because of the fact that there are headquarters of other organizations, but also because we have about 25 United Nations offices in Brussels. The UN family is very well represented here in Brussels, and we are really delighted that we can engage with the United Nations about this important problematic. And that's also vital for the EU because you may all know that the European Union, even per its own constitution, the Lisbon Treaty, whose 10th anniversary we celebrated last Sunday, actually committed the European Union to working very closely together with the United Nations. For the lawyers, Article 21 of the EU Treaty basically says that the European Union shall promote multilateral solutions to common problems, in particular in the framework of the United Nations. So it's obvious that we care about the United Nations and we're very eager to listen to a UN perspective on these very important issues. Thank you very much. Mrs. van Hout, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Professor Wouters. It is a particular honor for me to be with you today and to be a part of the RECONNECT project, in which the University of Louvain is such a driving force, because the University of Louvain is also where I studied. And it is quite unusual, actually, for a UN official to be posted in your own country, in your home country. So I've been in Brussels now for 2.5 years, after 20 years abroad. And as I was telling the ambassador, rediscovering Belgium. I would like to thank also the Embassy of Norway and the hospitality of Norway. I had already the privilege to be on the same podium on Monday evening, also talking about multilateralism. And before I start on the topic, I would like to pay tribute to someone who's in the audience, and that's my uncle, Hugo Pame, who's sitting there. And he is now retired from the European institutions, but he was the chief negotiator of the GATT agreement. And it is, to a great extent, his example that was an inspiration for me when I was young to go into international law and international politics. So I'm delighted that you can be with us, Nonkel Hugo. Now, let me start with values and legal obligations. As we approach International Human Rights Day, as you know, on 10 December, it is a timely moment to reflect on human rights, democracy, civic space, and the rule of law. Professor Wouters has already made reference to Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, but I'd like to read it for you. It says that the Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. And then it goes on to say, these values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. The distinction between the concepts in Article 2 is not always clear. For us practitioners, rule of law, democracy, equality, pluralism, and solidarity are all part of human rights, as they entitle every person, every individual to live a life in dignity. And this is also spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in various UN treaties. We know that the Universal Declaration was adopted, rising as a phoenix, as it were, from the ashes of the Second World War. It was meant to protect the individual against abuse of power by the state, and that's what we call freedom from fear, but also to allow each one of us to reach our full potential. And that's what we tend to refer to as freedom from want or freedom from need. Indeed, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights strikes a very careful balance between civil and political rights on the one hand and socio-economic and cultural rights on the other. And this is also why democracy and the rule of law are more than values. The fact that they are enshrined in international treaties make them legally binding upon the states that have become a party to these treaties. EU countries, as we know, have been driving forces behind the advancement of human rights globally, and they remain so today. And I would like to call on European countries to unequivocally support the two sets of rights in the Universal Declaration, because they are indivisible. Freedom from fear and freedom from want, particularly as social and economic injustice is driving unrest, which is threatening democracies around the world. Let's face it, terrorism and growing inequality within and among EU member states have caused a sense of insecurity throughout Europe. Some fear that their prosperity and hard-won entitlements are in danger. This has left many with a feeling that they are losing control. Unfortunately, it has also created fertile ground for xenophobia. And while legitimate grievances must be listened to and heard and addressed, at the same time we should be very wary of those who exploit fears for political gain. Increasingly, we, at the UN Human Rights Office here in Brussels, hear that time has come to be more pragmatic about human rights. Human rights are something for idealists, leftists even, or liberals. In some quarters, an anti-human rights discourse is audible, and calls can be heard for an end to liberal democracy as we know it. But from the perspective of the indivisibility of human rights, the term illiberal democracy, and for those of you who were at the European Parliament yesterday, you may have heard me say it there as well, it's an oxymoron. It was Koen Leenaerts, my former professor at the University of Leuven also, and currently president of the European Union Court of Justice, who said on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, there is no such thing as an illiberal democracy. Democracy is liberal or it is not. So is multilateralism in crisis? We often focus on the crisis of multilateralism, which purportedly affects both the EU and the UN. And we are indeed witnessing a strong reassertion by states of their national sovereignty. We're seeing also a stagnation of progress in the area of democratization, and even a withdrawal from international rule and policy making. But I would like to argue on a positive note that we are also witnessing an unprecedented interest in and engagement by non-state actors on human rights. I'm thinking of the private sector. Look, just recently we had the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights with a record number of attendees from the private sector. Last week, I met with 8 cities from across Europe, local authorities that are increasingly engaging on human rights. And then there are, of course, the social movements like older persons or climate activists, increasingly framing their concerns and demands in human rights terms. It is interesting, by the way, that the national sovereignty argument is mostly invoked by states that are subject to criticism over their human rights records. The dichotomy between national sovereignty and human rights is in reality a fake dichotomy, because a holistic interpretation of the notion of national sovereignty makes clear that sovereignty is bestowed on the state by the people, and that the authorities derive their legitimacy from the people. National sovereignty can never be a blank check for the arbitrary exercise of power by the executive. It comes with a responsibility vis-à-vis one's inhabitants and must situate itself within the boundaries of international law. Nevertheless, the rise of nationalism around the world, including in parts of Europe, means that the UN needs European countries to protect the human rights acquis in international fora against attempts to roll back what has been so painstakingly achieved. In reality, though, attention has always existed around who the UN represents. Its member states, which are not all democracies, or we the people, as the UN Charter says. The connection between the citizens and the UN, and could probably make the parallel reasoning for the EU, was construed via the member states. And this makes a direct connection with the people and between the people and our organizations sometimes difficult. In the case of the EU, the limited competence of EU institutions and the principle of subsidiarity add to the difficulty in connecting with the people. Having said that, the catastrophic scenario that was predicted in the lead-up to the European Parliament elections, that the Parliament would be overtaken by parties with extremist and isolationist agendas, failed to materialize. Citizen participation in the European Parliament election, as Professor Wouters already mentioned, was unprecedented, and by the way, it reversed a previously downward trend. People know that the challenges of today, climate change, social protection, migration, trade, cannot be addressed by any country alone, and that cooperation, however challenging, is necessary in an increasingly global world. As a result, the legitimacy of the European Parliament was actually enhanced, even if it is more polarized and more fragmented now than it was before. We've also witnessed a significant renewal of the European Parliament with 63% new members and a record number of female and young MEPs. It is also quite remarkable that the European Parliament, come to think of it, decide on the vote of designate commissioners. In which democracy do we see that at the national level? Can you think of a country where candidate ministers are subjected to this type of scrutiny by a national parliament? All of this to say that in the absence of the EU and the UN to tackle common challenges, both organizations would have to be reinvented. But of course, this does not immunize our organizations from criticism, and profound changes may still be necessary to position our organizations for the future. At the UN, our Secretary General has started an ambitious reform program to reposition the UN and it wants us to prioritize prevention over reaction. And as we know, for the time being, human rights remain the best compass to prevent social unrest, crisis, and war. Let me address now the EU as a human rights actor at home. As I was preparing for today, I came across a lecture that my predecessor, more than 5 years ago, delivered in the context of the FRAME program. In 2015, there was still so much resistance to the idea of the EU being a human rights actor at home. And yet now we know that the EU has been a formidable driver of progress in the area of human rights, and its ratification of international human rights instruments is causing a sea change throughout the European Union. Just think of the ripple effect of the ratification of the International Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities around Europe. And as we near 2020, we see ministers frequently discussing human rights and the rule of law in the EU General Affairs Council. How far we've come. The European Parliament, the new European Commission, and the Council President are all placing democracy and the rule of law high on the EU agenda. A European Democracy Action Plan, including legislative proposals on transparency of political advertising and clear financing of European political parties, shall be prepared. New portfolios for values, equality, and democracy have been created. Commitments have been made to a more social Europe, to the Sustainable Development Agenda, and to an economy that works for the people. A conference on the future of Europe, starting in 2020 for 2 years, shall be a platform for citizens to have their say on the EU. And we look forward to engaging with the EU on the future of Europe. We believe that it is important that international human rights norms and standards remain on the map and part of the moral compass of the European Union, particularly as in some areas they provide for greater protection of human rights than EU legislation. On the rule of law, the political guidelines of the new European Commission President von der Leyen note that strengthening the rule of law is a shared responsibility of all EU institutions and all member states. The Commission's monitoring will be strengthened with an additional European rule of law mechanism in close dialogue with national authorities. We also welcome the introduction of a rule of law conditionality by the European Commission in its multi-annual financial framework post-2020, or its proposal, and the support and the leadership that the Finnish EU presidency is showing, shepherding this through the Council. We hope that this provision of a rule of law conditionality will remain in place as the MFF goes through further review and negotiations. It is vital that EU funding is not used to support human rights violations. And in this regard, a closer connection between EU funding on the one hand and respect for human rights on the other is essential. We also welcome the Justice, Rights and Values Fund proposed by the Commission in the MFF, even though we believe its scope could be broader and its financial capacity enhanced. I'm not an expert on EU law, but from a UN perspective, I must admit that I am concerned about the dissociation of respect for the rule of law from other compelling areas, like academic and media freedom, the protection of minorities, or civic space. There is now a momentum on rule of law, but I note that this has only come in reaction to very real backsliding on the rule of law in a number of EU member states. We're also concerned about the length of current existing procedures. Will they be effective in turning the tide? UN mechanisms can and have provided early warnings with respect to deteriorating human rights situations. I'm thinking in particular of the UN Special Rapporteur on the independence of judges and lawyers, and the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders, for example, who documented very early on already their concerns on a number of EU countries. Now let us take a moment then to look at how the EU might realize its commitment to the rule of law and equality in practice. This summer, the Commission published its communication Blueprint for Action, Strengthening the Rule of Law in the Union. A key component of the effort to better protect the rule of law is the proposed Rule of Law review cycle. Under this cycle, it is proposed that the Commission will prepare an annual Rule of Law report. Now, at UN Human Rights, we have many years of experience in monitoring human rights and the rule of law around the world, and in supporting the Universal Periodic Review at the Human Rights Council. So as the EU reflects on the precise modalities for this new rule of law cycle, we stand ready to support and share advice from the UN system experience. First, it will be essential for the legitimacy of this endeavor that the cycle refers not only to EU law, but as I mentioned, also to the findings and standards of the international human rights system. Why? Because these are international treaties that EU member states have signed up to and that are binding to them. There is already a wealth of information regarding the situation on the rule of law and human rights in EU member states from the UN treaty bodies, the special procedures, and the Universal Periodic Review, under which all countries in the world are periodically reviewed and receive recommendations from their peers, from other states. Secondly, it will be vital for the new rule of law mechanism that it is participatory and that it collects information not only from states, from other states, but directly from national human rights institutions, equality bodies, and civil society. Democracy requires people's continuous and inclusive participation. Reference to the guidelines on the right to participate, the UN guidelines on the right to participate in public affairs, as adopted by the UN Human Rights Council, could be useful in this regard. Sadly, throughout Europe, we are also witnessing how space for civil society is being shrunk. And I'm deliberately using the term being shrunk and not shrinking, as it is not the result of an invisible hand. This poses a real problem, because an empowered civil society is an essential feature of democracy. As the Polish philosopher Zygmunt Bauman said, the best possible society is one that is always aware of its imperfections and continuously strives to overcome them. The hundreds of thousands of young people calling for climate action on the streets of Europe and around the world are a powerful reminder of how critical freedom of expression and assembly are for progress. In recent months, environmental activists have inspired millions of people around the globe. Unfortunately, they have also faced, like many human rights defenders, a barrage of online attacks. Investigative journalists have been murdered in the European Union. Human rights defenders are stigmatized and harassed in a growing number of countries. Staff of national human rights institutions and equality bodies are targeted and defamed. Growing numbers of activists are affected by the increasingly hostile climate. And remember that 1 in 4 persons in the EU volunteer for a local group, an association, an NGO, or any other type of civil society organization. Now, we know from our work around the world that a vibrant and critical civil society is a prerequisite for strong, resilient states and democracies. Conversely, when civic space is reduced or threatened, this sets in motion a downward spiral with a profound impact on human rights and society as a whole. In the EU, the protection of human rights defenders and civic space has long been approached as a foreign policy issue. Indeed, and I'll talk a bit more about that later, the EU is a vocal advocate and ally for human rights around the world, providing assistance and protection to activists and defenders. Unfortunately, from various countries in Europe, our office now receives daily reports of restrictive national legislation, tax laws, judicial harassment, excessive administrative burdens, and funding cuts. These are starve and strangle policies. And the extreme manifestation of this are the so-called délits de solidarité, or the criminalization of the defense of human rights in some countries. In addition to shrinking space, we are also noticing that space for civil society is shifting. We're seeing the creation of dozens of new NGOs that receive privileged access to and funding by their national governments. And while, of course, the diversity of civil society is to be welcomed, this contributes sometimes to human rights defenders to feel as they're being spied upon by other civil society representatives. Earlier this year, the Secretary General, the UN Secretary General, issued his report on intimidation and reprisals of civil society for cooperating with the UN on human rights. Unfortunately, for the first time, 3 EU countries were listed. And there is a potential domino effect, both within the EU and beyond its borders. We believe in the positive contribution that the EU Fundamental Rights Agency is making to safeguarding human rights in the EU, and I'd like to use this opportunity to really pay tribute to the great work that they are doing. We welcome also their publication on Shrinking Space, which contains important recommendations for member states. I would add to that the EU must match its external policy frameworks and tools for human rights defenders with an equivalent program to monitor the intimidation and harassment of human rights defenders in the European Union. And it should be prepared to extend emergency protection when needed. We know now that a number of civil society organizations in Europe would not have survived if it were not for the tremendous support of the Norway grants. Civic space should also, therefore, be monitored as part of the new rule of law mechanism. Now, I would like to touch for a moment on the twin human rights principles of equality and non-discrimination. Again, we note that it is the most vulnerable groups who are the first to suffer when there is backsliding on the rule of law and democracy. SDG 10 on combating inequality recognizes this. The EU has historically acted as a key driver in the struggle for equality and inclusion. Yet despite the EU's founding values and legal framework, including the decade-old Charter of Fundamental Rights, discrimination is still a reality, a fact of life for millions of people in the European Union. And to cite but one example, I would like to speak to the plight of the Roma in Europe. Approximately 10 to 12 million in number, the Roma constitute Europe's largest ethnic minority. Yet in many countries, they are still viewed as second-class citizens. The human rights crisis facing the Roma is not new. For centuries, the Roma in Europe have been systematically dehumanized, abused, and excluded. Across Europe, many Roma continue to be the victims of forced evictions, which are sometimes racially motivated and not always in compliance with international human rights law. We need a new EU framework for Roma inclusion that is human rights based. The EU and its member states must respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of the Roma as they do for other Europeans, while at the same time denouncing and tackling prejudice against Roma among the majority population. Another example. You don't need to go far here from this beautiful location to see the explosion of homelessness around the EU, with the exception of Finland. Some EU countries are even moving to criminalize homelessness, even though that we know that the homelessness crisis in Europe is not a fatality, but the result of an approach that sees housing as a commodity instead of a human right. At EU level again, a broad view must be taken to see the rule of law and equality as two sides of the same coin. Having a dedicated European Commissioner for Equality gives us a real opportunity. On the other hand, we're also concerned that the spreading of the human rights and democracy portfolios over many different commissioners also risk diluting accountability. We support calls for the strengthening of the legal framework for equality and inclusion in the EU. It is now 10 years since the European Commission has proposed an equal treatment directive to ban discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief, disability, age or sexual orientation in all areas of social life. This directive aimed to propose an EU-wide minimum level of protection against discrimination through a horizontal approach, complementing thereby the existing EU Employment Equality Directive, which forbids discrimination in employment, and the Race Equality Directives. Unfortunately, the proposed directive is blocked at the Council of the European Union since 2008. As a report by the EU's Fundamental Rights Agency has pointed out, the non-adoption of this law is in itself a hindrance to realizing the commitment of the Sustainable Development Agenda to leave no one behind. In light of the backlash that minorities are facing around the European Union, we believe the EU has a unique role to play in enforcing equal rights for minorities. Let me be clear. This is not about asking for some form of special treatment for minorities, but merely the ability for them to enjoy the same rights as the majority population. We also need the EU to accede to the Istanbul Convention to address violence against women. This may not be a popular move in some countries, yet it is in areas like equality that the true commitment of the European Union to a union that strives for more will be tested, and that the EU has to show it comes down on the right side of history. What I just mentioned is often referred to by practitioners as the internal-external policy coherence. Recently, I had the honor of being invited to strategize with some EU governments on what more the EU could do to support LGBTI communities around the world and to help advance the rights of LGBTI persons. And the week after, I met with LGBTI activists from around Europe, some of whom told me harrowing stories of harassment, smear campaigns, and even hate crimes. The contrast could not have been starker. I would also caution about the use of the term European values. While of course for us this refers to Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union, in international affairs, the expression risks being interpreted as if human rights are a foreign element imported from Europe. It may thus unwittingly reinforce cultural relativism theories. Now let me move to the EU as a global human rights actor. There are two major multilateral processes that states have relatively recently committed to and that Europe can leverage to advance democracy, human rights, and the rule of law globally. Already now, the recommendations of the Universal Periodic Review provide a cornerstone for the EU's human rights dialogues. And it's very interesting also that next week the EU human rights dialogue with the United States will take place. Human rights are also, as we know, at the heart of the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, which is, we welcome the fact that EU commissioners, all EU commissioners, have actually for the first time received instructions to ensure that the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals takes place within their respective policy areas. Contrary to the Millennium Development Goals, the UN Sustainable Development Agenda is a universal agenda to which all EU countries have committed themselves. What further differentiates the Sustainable Development Agenda from the Millennium Development Goals is that it links development not only to the realization of economic and social rights, but also for the first time to respect for civil and political rights. Target 16 of the Sustainable Development Agenda calls for promoting the rule of law and ensuring equal access to justice for all. It also calls for ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. In June, EU Foreign Affairs ministers agreed Council conclusions on strengthening multilateralism, and they firmly restate the EU's commitment to an international rule-based order. By doing so, EU foreign ministers also expressed their support for our organization, the UN Human Rights Office, as a driver for democracy and human rights within the UN system. They equally acknowledge that the rule of law is an essential principle to the legitimacy of their own foreign policy efforts. The gradual withdrawal of the United States from the UN calls for an active and strong role by the European Union in the Human Rights Council. This, of course, requires that European countries are united on an ambitious human rights agenda among themselves and do not fall prey to the lowest common denominator. And I'll tell you a joke from the corridors of the Palais des Nations in Geneva. And they say when negotiations take place, that the Europeans are exhausted by the time they come in the room because they have done all their internal negotiations, right? We do need the European Union to protect the independent mandate of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and to stand up for the office and its work. Even though, there are 3 pillars in the UN Charter: human rights, peace and security, development, and for some reason human rights is always called the 3rd pillar. For me, it's the 1st pillar, of course. But our organization receives less than 4% of the UN budget. And when you know that 25% of assessed contributions are provided by the United States of America, which has already cut funding to several UN organizations, it is fair to say that our organization and our work is extremely vulnerable. Together, the EU member states and the European Commission are providing more extra budgetary funding to the UN Human Rights Office and its 80 field presences around the world than the rest of the world taken together. And this is particularly appreciated. On the broader issue of democracy, as you may be aware, the EU foreign ministers also adopted ambitious conclusions in October this year. They recalled that one of the aims of EU external action is to advance democracy, the rule of law, the universality and indivisibility of human rights, as set out in Article 21 of the Treaty of the European Union. We welcome the ambition of these conclusions, and they act as a blueprint for action. We frequently welcome human rights defenders from across the world to our office here in Brussels. The EU, you should know, remains a beacon of light for these people, a champion, and at times a lifeline for human rights defenders working in very precarious circumstances. Just a few weeks ago, we welcomed a group of brave women human rights defenders from across South America. And they carried a similar message about the vital importance of EU support for their work, and expressed the hope that all EU delegations, without exception, would express and openly support civil society. Indeed, we need to foster innovative approaches in response to the constantly evolving restrictions and the global trend to reduce civil society space. EU delegations work hand in hand with our field presences around the world to try and create some space or more space for civil society. And the EU's Protect Defenders program has provided assistance to some 300 activists just last year, academics and journalists also. In the UN Human Rights Council, EU member states run UN resolutions in support of democracy, the rule of law, civil society, and a broad range of human rights issues. Now we will be looking to further increase our collaboration with EU delegations and to work towards a joint strategy in response to the burgeoning challenges that human rights defenders face worldwide. We're also supportive of new Council conclusions on human rights defenders, which could give political backing to such a strategy. Now let's not forget that the state at all levels is the primary duty bearer when it comes to making human rights a reality on the ground. And the EU nor our field presences are a substitute for that state responsibility. It is at the national and local levels that human rights must eventually be realized, and change must come from within. Therefore, an important part of our work is to empower national human rights institutions, to train equality bodies and civil society organizations so that they can hold their governments to account. Now, when states have transferred certain competencies to regional organizations, as is the case in the Organization of American States, the European Union, or the African Union, we will advocate with these organizations to align their laws, policies, and practices with the UN norms and standards, or at least not to violate the legal obligations that their member states have contracted. It is said that the test for the strength of the rule of law can be seen in how our justice systems deal with the most vulnerable. Over the past years, the EU has come under increasing pressure to limit migration to Europe. The EU has stepped up its work with third countries on migration control, and we see EU agencies such as Frontex and Europol increasingly operating in the EU neighborhood. In recent months, actions by several countries in Europe to criminalize, impede, or halt the work of humanitarian rescue vessels and search planes, and the sharp decrease, therefore, in the number of search and rescue vessels operated in the Mediterranean have had deadly consequences for adults and children seeking safety. By end November, our colleagues from UNHCR had reported the death by drowning of over 1,448 migrants in the Mediterranean. And of course, many more deaths have probably gone unrecorded. Our High Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, has raised serious concern regarding the loss of life in the Mediterranean, the externalization of EU borders, pushbacks, and the forcible return of migrants to countries where their safety may be endangered, such as Libya. She expressed her support for the principled work of many courts and tribunals across the European Union, which continue to uphold national and international law for the necessary protection of people on the move, and despite some judges facing smear campaigns. States, of course, have a right to determine whether nationals may enter or remain on their, whether non-nationals may enter and remain on their territory. But all migration governance measures should be implemented with full respect for the human rights and the rule of law. I mention this topic as I feel it is a very serious test of the EU's resolve on the rule of law. Under which jurisdiction falls the oversight of the actions of the EU's common foreign and foreign security policy? EU accession to the European Convention on Human Rights could hold the answer. To uphold its commitment to the rule of law, the EU and its member states should move away from the informal nature of some of the agreements on migration with third countries, such as the EU-Turkey deal. Instead, they should ensure that such agreements are anchored in the rule of law and open to judicial review. I would like to use the topic of migration as a segue into the role and responsibility of the EU to promote democracy and human rights in its development cooperation. European Commissioner for International Partnerships, Jutta Urpilainen, has been tasked with the development of a comprehensive strategy for Africa and comprehensive partnerships with countries of migration, origin, and transit, bringing together all tools, instruments, and leverage. More specifically, the mission letter she received calls on her to adapt bilateral funding to achieving EU objectives on migration management. Migration is a complex phenomenon, and research on the links between development and migration is inconclusive. And I would like to invite everybody in this room who hasn't done so to read this amazing report from UNDP. It's called Scaling Fences, Voices of Irregular African Migrants to Europe. This study interviewed almost 2,000 migrants from almost 40 African countries, living currently in 13 European countries. And all of them self-declared that they are not political refugees, but that they came to Europe and that they did not come to Europe to seek asylum. Well, the results of this report comes up with some counterintuitive findings. It finds that actually getting a job was not the only nor primary motivation for many of them to move. That not all irregular migrants were poor in Africa, nor did they have lower education levels. Actually, quite the contrary. And only 2 of these migrants, who are often labeled economic migrants, said that a greater awareness of the risks and of the journey would have caused them to stay at home, only 2%. Interestingly, 77% felt that at home their voice was unheard and that their country's political system provided no opportunity through which they could exert influence on government. 62% felt they had been treated unfairly by their governments, with many pointing to ethnicity and political views as a reason for this perception. This shows the great need for the EU and its member states to intensify their support for democratization, the rule of law, participation, good governance, and accountability in its development partnerships. To be coherent, European actors should also question regional and national policies and business practices towards countries in the neighborhood or in the global south that make the enjoyment of human rights by the people living in these countries more difficult. In fact, human rights impact assessments should become a standard part of all legislative action and policy making in EU member states, as well as for the Union itself. As the European Commission fashions itself as a geopolitical commission, the risk is real that a rights-based approach to development becomes subservient to a migration approach to development. There should be no trade-off between political interests and human rights, or between development support and the dignity and rights of migrants and refugees in Europe. Now let me say a few words about peace and security. We are witnessing a multitude of violent and complex conflicts and crises around the world. As Europe assumes a more assertive role on the global scene, a stronger Europe in the world, as President von der Leyen has put it, respect and promotion for human rights and the rule of law in peace and security is clearly an area that requires continued and urgent attention, and incrementally so as the UN and the EU become more engaged in conducting and supporting security operations, including those carried out by regional and sub-regional entities such as the G5 Sahel. Military operations such as counterterrorism, which often require an offensive posture, pose a risk of harm to civilians. Violations of human rights and humanitarian law that may occur during such operations can lead to more violence and radicalization and undermine the very goals of the actions we support at such great political and financial cost. As the Secretary General told the Human Rights Council, we have proven that it is only possible to fight terrorism successfully when human rights are upheld. To prevent and mitigate violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, military engagement therefore requires the establishment of due diligence and compliance frameworks. What is a compliance framework? A compliance framework requires proactive measures at the level of the selection and screening of troops and commanders, their training on human rights, planning of operations and after-action reviews, monitoring and reporting, accountability mechanisms in case things go wrong, as well as clear rules to guarantee respect by the troops for international law. As the Security Council emphasized in the case of the G5 Sahel, for example, a compliance framework is critical to gain the trust of local populations and thus for the effectiveness and legitimacy of the joint force supported by the European Union. At the level of the UN, the experience we matured over many years and countries in supporting non-UN security forces operationally, logistically, and financially led us to adopt in 2011 a due diligence policy, compulsory for all entities that engage with non-UN forces, be they national armies, regional or sub-regional operations. As the EU reforms its financial instruments and establishes a European peace facility to finance common security and defense policy operations with military implications, a robust EU human rights due diligence policy is necessary to mitigate the risks of serious human rights violations by the recipient entity and to discontinue support in case risks remain unmitigated. We will be calling on the EU and offering our support to the EU to ensure due diligence in its foreign policy and defense missions. Again, to uphold the commitment to the rule of law means also rethinking at times how the EU carries out its foreign policy. I've spoken today about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law across the EU's domestic, foreign, and development agendas. Let me emphasize the importance of bringing these different streams together as a vital point for the EU's credibility internationally. Indeed, consistency between international and external policy choices and actions on human rights, the rule of law, and civic space will be critical. The EU is currently developing a new action plan on democracy and human rights, as the current action plan expires at the end of this year. It will be important that this plan is ambitious, but also precise and clear on who is responsible and how progress will be measured. The action plan could also provide, why not, a roadmap that looks at the EU's internal and external work on human rights and democracy under the same umbrella. Right now, the plan is only for human rights externally. This could drive better coordination across the new Commission portfolios and among EU institutions. We also look forward to consultation and transparency in the discussions on the EU Action Plan for Democracy and Human Rights. Our office is currently chairing the informal UN agency working group in Brussels on this topic, and we stand ready to provide concrete ideas and comments on the new action plan. As the EU, in conclusion, looks to the next 5 years on how to better protect and promote democracy, human rights, the rule of law, and civic space, let me envision that to the UN, an EU for human rights is an EU that champions all human rights, an EU that puts forward strong common positions in support of human rights at the Human Rights Council, and EU member states that create space for human rights at the Security Council, an EU that enables civil society's continuous participation in policy making, not only in the values and justice portfolios, but in all areas of competence of the EU, an EU that understands how its own credibility and functioning is contingent upon respect for the rule of law and the protection of a vibrant civic space in its member states, an EU that asserts its role as a driver for equality, an EU that submits itself to the rule of law, also in external action, and an EU that focuses on prevention. Ladies and gentlemen, there is great power and authority in many voices speaking as one behind the core ideal of both the EU and the UN, namely that we can only attain peace, security, and sustainable development for all societies when we advance the dignity and equality of all human beings.